The wind moved slowly across the open land, touching the tall grass and carrying with it the smell of dry earth and horses. The sun had almost disappeared behind the far hills, painting the sky in soft orange and fading pink. A rancher rode home on his tired horse after a long day of work. His hat sat low on his head and his coat was dusty from the fields. All he wanted was a quiet evening, a warm fire, and a moment to rest his sore hands. But just as he turned the horse down the narrow trail near the broken fence line, he heard something. At first it was so soft he thought the wind had tricked him. Then it came again, a small sound, a weak cry. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was human. He pulled the reins gently and his horse stopped. The prairie had gone still. Only the sound of crickets filled the air. The rancher narrowed his eyes toward the sound, feeling a strange chill inside him. He climbed down from the saddle, his boots pressing into the dry ground with a soft crunch. His horse gave a quiet snort as he walked closer to the fence. Then in the fading light he saw something near a broken wagon wheel. A young woman lay on the ground, her dress covered in dust and the hem torn from the rough prairie. Her hands were holding her leg tightly and her face was pale. When she noticed him, her eyes widened slightly, filled with pain and fear. She tried to lift herself, but her body trembled. "There, it hurts," she whispered in a soft, broken voice. The rancher froze. The sound of her voice struck him deep inside. It wasn't just a stranger in trouble. It reminded him of a memory he had locked away for years. A night long ago when someone close to him had cried out in pain, and he had arrived too late. His heart thudded hard in his chest. For a second he could not move. The sky grew darker and the wind picked up a little. He could see her ankle twisted at an odd angle. Her wagon must have broken down and she must have fallen trying to walk. Her breathing was uneven and she was shivering slightly from the cold creeping in. The rancher took a step forward. His boots scraped against a rock and she flinched like a scared deer. He slowly raised his hands a little to show he meant no harm. "Easy," he said in a calm voice, though his own throat felt tight. "I'm not going to hurt you." She blinked, still breathing fast, but she didn't try to crawl away. He knelt beside her carefully. The ground felt cold through his jeans. Up close he could see that her ankle was badly swollen. It wasn't bleeding, but it was twisted badly enough that she couldn't walk on it. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, and it looked like she had been out there for hours. "Can you move?" he asked quietly. She shook her head slowly, biting her lip. Her eyes filled with tears. She wasn't crying loudly, but the pain was clear. The rancher looked around. The land stretched wide and silent. There was no wagon team, no camp, no light from other travelers. She was alone. The nearest town was miles away and night was coming fast. He could ride to get help, but that would take hours, and the cold would only get worse. He leaned back on his heels, unsure of what to do. He had made a promise long ago not to let strangers near his ranch. That promise had grown from loss and regret, something he never told anyone. It was safer that way, he told himself, safer to keep his distance. But now, watching this young woman in pain, something inside him shifted. The woman tried to sit up again but winced sharply and fell back. A soft pained sound escaped her lips. She was trying not to look afraid, but her hands were trembling. The rancher swallowed hard. "All right," he finally said, almost to himself. "All right," he gently slid one arm behind her shoulders. She stiffened at first, but when she realized he wasn't rough, her body relaxed just a little. "We need to get you out of here," he said. She didn't answer, only gave a weak nod. When he lifted her, her body was lighter than he expected. She let out a soft gasp as the pain from her ankle shot through her, and his jaw tightened. He carefully carried her toward the horse. The animal shifted its hooves nervously but stayed still when the rancher whispered to it. The woman's head rested against his shoulder as he placed her gently on the saddle. She gripped the horn tightly, her knuckles turning pale. The rancher climbed up behind her, steadying her with one arm so she wouldn't fall. The night wind grew colder as the horse began to walk down the trail. Crickets sang louder. Far away a coyote howled and the woman shuddered. He could feel her fear. She was alone, hurt, and trusting a stranger with no choice. He kept his eyes on the path, guiding the horse slowly to avoid any sudden jolts. His mind was a storm. He hadn't let anyone close to his ranch in years. He told himself it was better that way. People brought trouble. But as the horse carried them toward the dim lights of his property, He realized this night had already broken every rule he set for himself. The ranch wasn't far now. A few wooden fences stood in the distance, dark shapes against the sky. Smoke from the small chimney drifted upward, showing that the fire inside was still alive from the morning. He thought of what would happen when they reached it. He didn't even have a proper place ready for guests anymore, but leaving her alone on the prairie wasn't an option. She whispered something he couldn't quite hear, and when he leaned closer, she said in a weak voice, "Thank you." It was soft and shaky, but real. That small word felt heavier than any weight he had carried on the ranch. His throat felt dry. He didn't answer, just kept riding, focusing on the soft sound of hooves. But deep inside, he knew something had changed. When they reached the gate, the horse stopped with a soft snort. The rancher climbed down carefully, then lifted her down with steady arms. She was shaking from pain and cold, but she didn't look as afraid as before. The soft glow from the house lantern touched her face, and for the first time, he saw the gentleness in her eyes beneath all that pain. He hadn't planned for any of this. He hadn't wanted any of this. But sometimes life on the frontier didn't wait for your plans. Sometimes it simply happened. He held her steady as they walked slowly toward the porch. Each step made her wince, but she didn't complain. The night wrapped around them like a blanket, silent, wide, and endless. Somewhere out there, the coyotes sang again, but here, under the warm glow of the lantern, it felt a little safer. Inside, the fire would be waiting. And though he didn't know what tomorrow would bring, tonight one thing was clear. The man who once promised to never open his door to strangers had already broken that promise the moment he stopped on that trail. And as he glanced at her pale, tired face, he knew deep down, he didn't regret it. The rancher gently opened the old wooden door, and the warm air from the small cabin wrapped around them like a soft blanket. Inside, the fire he had left earlier was still burning low, glowing softly against the rough log walls. Shadows danced across the floor, and the crackling sound of the fire was the only noise for a moment. He held her carefully as she leaned on him, every step slow and unsteady. Her ankle could barely carry any weight, but she didn't make a single complaint. Her eyes followed the light like it was the first safe thing she had seen all day. He guided her to the old armchair near the fire. It was worn but soft and warm, and when she sank into it, her shoulders relaxed just a little. She let out a quiet breath, the kind that comes from both pain and relief. The rancher knelt down beside the chair, pulling his leather gloves off and tossing them onto the table. His hands were rough, marked by years of ranch work, but they were steady. He walked to a small wooden chest by the wall. It hadn't been opened in years. Dust covered the lid. For a moment, his hand hovered over it because everything inside carried a memory. Finally, he lifted it open. Inside were a few old bandages, a small bottle of alcohol, some cloth, and a pair of worn scissors. It was the same box he once used to help someone he loved long ago. He brought it to the chair and knelt again. "This might hurt a little," he said in a quiet, steady voice. She nodded silently, trusting him now. He untied the laces around her worn boot and pulled it off carefully. She flinched slightly, and her fingers dug into the sides of the chair. He saw the swelling clearly now, the ankle twisted but not broken. That was a relief. He gently wrapped a wet cloth around it to ease the pain, then began to bind it with steady hands. She didn't say much, just watched him with tired eyes. Her breathing slowed as the warmth from the fire touched her face. "You've done this before," she whispered softly. He didn't look up right away. "A long time ago," he answered. The wind outside blew hard against the walls of the cabin, but inside, it felt like a small island of quiet. He finished tying the bandage and set the rest of the supplies aside. She looked at her ankle, then back at him with a faint, grateful smile. He stood up slowly, his knees stiff from kneeling on the hard floor, and went to put a pot of water over the fire. The kettle hissed as it warmed, and the air filled with the smell of steam and wood smoke. He poured her a tin cup of warm water and handed it to her. Her fingers trembled as she took it, but the warmth seemed to calm her. She looked around the cabin, the plain table, the simple shelves, the hat hanging on the wall. "You live here alone?" she asked softly. He nodded, leaning against the table. "Just me and the horse," he replied. Her eyes lowered, and for a second there was silence again. Then she said, "I was trying to reach a small town, maybe 5 miles west. Our wagon wheel broke, and my brother went to get help. But he didn't come back." Her voice cracked slightly at the last words. The rancher listened quietly. He knew the land well. 5 miles west meant she had been lying out there for hours, maybe since the sun was high. If he hadn't heard her weak cry, the cold would have swallowed her before dawn. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked in a quiet, worried voice. The rancher didn't like making promises he couldn't keep. He set his jaw and said carefully, "Maybe he got stuck or lost the trail. I'll look at first light." She nodded slowly, holding the cup close to her chest. The firelight flickered softly across her face, showing both exhaustion and relief. For the first time since he found her, she didn't look like she was fighting fear alone. He placed another log on the fire. Sparks rose up and disappeared into the dark chimney. Then he sat down across from her. The chair creaked softly beneath his weight. The ranch was quiet, the kind of quiet that can feel both comforting and heavy. He wasn't used to anyone sitting there. For years it had only been him. He had built a wall around his heart made of silence and work, but now someone was here. Someone whose voice filled the space where only the wind and the fire used to speak. Her eyes slowly closed for a moment, tiredness taking over. Then she opened them again. "Thank you," she whispered. The simple word made something shift deep inside him. He wasn't sure if it was guilt, relief, or something he had forgotten how to feel. Outside, the coyotes howled again, distant and cold. But they couldn't reach here. This cabin was a safe place for now. He stood and walked to the door, checking the latch and making sure the lantern outside was still burning. When he came back, she had drifted into a light sleep in the chair. The firelight made her look softer, less like the stranger he'd picked up from the dirt road and more like someone who belonged to this land. He covered her lightly with a wool blanket from the back of the couch. He sat back down, leaning his elbows on his knees. His mind returned to the night years ago when a storm had taken someone from him. That night had left a scar so deep he stopped letting people near. He thought it was safer this way. No one to lose, no one to save too late. But tonight he had broken his own rule without even thinking. The kettle whistled softly again. He poured himself some warm water and sat there, listening to the quiet breathing of the woman sleeping near the fire. As the night grew darker, the world outside disappeared into silence. He could hear the wind against the roof, the fire crackling, and his own heartbeat. He thought about the morning. He would ride out and find her brother if he could. He would fix the broken wagon or bring them both to town. But he also knew something deeper, something he hadn't admitted in years. Helping her had awakened a part of him he thought was gone. A part that cared. A part that still believed doing the right thing mattered. Hours passed slowly. The stars moved above the roof. At one point she stirred and whispered his name softly, though he was sure she didn't even know it. He didn't answer but watched as her breathing calmed again. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the rancher stood quietly. The world outside was still cold, but it looked different now, not as empty as before. He saddled the horse, ready to search the trail for her brother. He left a pot of water near the fire so she would have something warm when she woke. He glanced at her one last time before stepping outside. She was still asleep, safe, wrapped in the blanket, the firelight still dancing around her. The rancher had spent years alone, letting the world pass by without touching his heart. But this night had changed something. She had come into his quiet life by accident, but she had also brought back something he thought was lost forever, a sense of connection. As the door closed behind him and the morning wind met his face, he realized that what he had done might have been unthinkable to the man he used to be, but to the man who walked out into the light now it felt right. He rode off into the soft gold of morning with a steady heart. The world was wide and wild, but he was no longer completely alone. Something had shifted, quiet but real, like the first warm ray of light after a long, cold night.